Eritrean literature in the Tigrinya language dates, as far as is known, from the late 19th century. It was initially encouraged by European missionaries, but suffered from the general repression of Eritrean culture under Fascist rule in the 1920s and 30s. The earliest published works were primarily translations or collections of traditional poems, fables and folk tales. But the renaissance of Eritrean culture promoted by the British administrators after 1942 included the appearance of the first novels in Tigrinya. Origins. Between the 4th and 11th centuries AD, the GEEZ language was the main language of the Aksumite Empire, and for some time thereafter it remained the language of literature. This literature, shared between Eritrea and Ethiopia, consisted mainly of historical tales about royalty and noblemen, ecclesiastical works, often in translation, and religious poetry. GEEZ passed down to modern Tigrinya the GEEZ alphabet and a substantial vocabulary. The continued dominance of GEEZ as a literary language after it was supplanted by Tigrinya as a demotic tongue means that very little is known of low literature prior to the arrival of European missionaries in the 19th century. The first work published in Tigrinya was a translation of the Gospels, written in the 1830s and published in 1866. European missionaries were responsible for a stream of publications from the 1890s onwards, including the first Tigrinya language newspaper in 1909. First publications. The first literary text in Tigrinya was published in Europe itself. In 1895 Feseta Georgius, an Ethiopian, published a pamphlet in Rome giving an account of his journey to Italy 5 years earlier. Georgius was a scholar who taught Tigrinya in Naples, as well as studying the Italian and Latin languages. He was very conscious of his trailblazing role as the father of Tigrinya literature. In his foreword to the work, he wrote that, "Our main drive has been to furnish those who yearn to learn Tigrinya with material for exercise." The content of the pamphlet indicates that his primary audience, however, was the educated elite of his home country, as it focuses on the author's impressions of the exotic country to which he had traveled. Nagash praises the artistic quality of the work, arguing that it is endowed with special linguistic mastery and artistic literary craftsmanship. In the early years of the 20th century, several further works appeared. The first of these was a collection of 40 fables and folk tales by Gebremedhindini. This was published in a journal in Rome in 1902. It contains 9 fables with animal characters, typically depicting the stronger animals as unjust and untrustworthy, while the weaker animals are virtuous but powerless. The other 31 stories are folk tales, including The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Other publications of this period included 3 collections of oral poetry by Carlo Conti Rossini, Johannes Kolmodin and Jacques Faithlovich. Conti Rossini published his Tigrinya popular songs between 1903 and 1906. This ran to 166 works, with notes and commentary in Italian. It is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 contains 73 love poems, mostly by men, while Part 2 consists of lovers' complaints. Part 3, called Songs of Various Arguments, includes more substantial works, notably mass poems, written for special occasions and combining entertainment, education and praise for tribal leaders, Melka, written for funerals and praising the deceased, and Doga, poems of general mourning. 2 of the mass are accounts of the late 19th century conflict between 2 chiefs, Raswelda Michael of Hazaga and Egiat Halu of Sazaga, an event which has continued to be the subject of folk narratives down to the present day. It is also a substantial presence in Kolmodin's collection, Traditions of Sazaga and Saga, which forms a narrative of the history of Eritrea over the few centuries preceding the Italian colonization. Finally, Faithlovich's Habasha poetry is a collection of 125 Dogger poems, assembled from the preceding work of Winquist and Twaldmetan of the Swedish mission. One original work from this period was How the World Was Set Ablaze Because of Two Serpents, a 270-line poem published anonymously in Rome in 1916. The work is a commentary on the First World War, which the author sees as a war between the true Christian countries of the Entente powers and the champions of Islam, Austro-Hungary and Germany. In his preface, he explains that he read it because, "I want you to know in time about this terrible darkness which has deeply affected my conscience. Fascism." The remainder of the Italian colonial period, particularly after the rise of fascism in Italy, was a lean time for Eritrean literature. Education became a matter of indoctrination, emphasizing the superiority of Italian over native culture. The missionary education efforts which had helped to give birth to an Eritrean literary culture were discouraged by the colonial administration. The only substantial fruit of this period was a further volume from Conte Rossini. His Tigrinya Traditional Proverbs and Songs was published in 1942, immediately after the end of Italian rule. This was again a work in 3 sections. The first, a collection of almost 500 proverbs, with Italian commentary; the second, accounts of Eritrean traditions and lineage; and the third, a mix of 86 Mesa, Melka and Dogger poems. The effect of the occupation is apparent in a number of poems praising the Italian rulers. Renaissance. The incoming British administration had a much more enlightened attitude to its subjects than its predecessor. Edward Ullendorff has said that the 30 years from about 1942 until the early 1970s witnessed the greatest flowering of TNA writing hitherto encountered. One of the driving forces behind this blossoming was the Eritrean Weekly News. Supported by the British authorities, this publication went through 520 issues over 10 years from 1942, with a circulation of around 5,000 copies. It was edited by Atto Waldemar Waldemariam, another employee of the Swedish mission in Asmara, and published a wide range of fiction and non-fiction as well as news stories. The paper was also associated with the Tigrinya Language Council, a body established in 1944 to promote a modernized, correct form of the Tigrinya language. Despite this literary renaissance, no Tigrinya books were published until the late 1940s. This has been attributed to a lack of funds and publishing know-how among the Tigrinya intelligentsia, and to the continuing control by Italians of the country's few printing presses. The breakthrough came in 1949, when Jacob Ghebreyesus published Legends, Stories and Proverbs of the Ancestors. Ghebreyesus was a Catholic priest and teacher, and published his collection of 100 stories, 3,300 proverbs, and various poems in order to provide reading material for his pupils. The first Tigrinya language novel appeared in 1949-50, although it was originally written in 1927. A Story of a Conscript by Ghebreyesus Halu tells the story in 61 pages of a group of Eritreans forced to fight for the Italians in Libya. The hero returns to his village after many travails, only to find that his mother has died in his absence. He composes a Melks poem mourning her death and condemning the rule of the Italians. Another novel, Dawn of Freedom, published by Tekliza Weldy in 19 1954, has a similar theme, telling the story of several generations of one family opposed to Italian rule. It is written on a more sophisticated technical level than Hallu's work, often interweaving multiple narrative strands in a single chapter. A third work published around this time, Resurrection and Victory by Zega Ieyasu, is an unambiguously moralistic and religiously didactic allegory. Over the next 20 years, many further volumes appeared in the already established traditions of didactic fictions, novels, anthologies and translations.